I think Mike Johnson is great. You know, he's had a majority of 2, 3, 4, then back to 2. We actually had 1. So we were 1 heart attack away from disaster. So everybody prayed for everybody's health. I think Mike Johnson's been a fantastic speaker. I mean, a very hard job because, you know, when you have a small majority, and we got the biggest bill in the history of our country approved, the Great Big Beautiful Bill. I call it the Great Big Beautiful Bill. There are different names for it, but to me it's a Great Big Beautiful Bill because it gives the biggest tax cuts in history, the biggest regulation cuts in history. No tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. I think Mike Johnson's been a great speaker. I think few people...
Let me start with the obvious, because it cannot be ignored, and you need to feel the magnitude of what we just witnessed in that clip, the sheer grotesque brazenness of it, the way Trump stands there and verbalizes the precarity of Republican rule with a casual flippancy that would be comical if it weren't so chilling, saying they were 1 heart attack from disaster, as if he's narrating some kind of darkly comic reality show rather than describing the actual functioning of American democracy. And this isn't a slip of the tongue or a gaffe, but rather the unvarnished truth spoken aloud by someone who has never understood the concept of decorum, or the idea that some truths are supposed to remain unspoken in polite political society, because they reveal too much about the cynical calculations that animate the entire conservative project. Republicans kicked off the 11/19th Congress with a 5-seat majority in the House of Representatives, the smallest margin of control in modern history, and just 2 GOP defectors could block Johnson from winning the top job, which means that every single Republican heartbeat quite literally determines whether they can cling to power, and Trump just said that part out loud. He just admitted that their entire legislative agenda hangs by the thinnest of biological threads, and then without missing a beat, he pivots to gushing about Mike Johnson being fantastic, and celebrating what he calls the Great Big Beautiful Bill, like he's selling you a timeshare in Mar-a-Lago, rather than describing legislation that will fundamentally reshape the American economic landscape. Now let's talk about that bill, because this is where the moral bankruptcy becomes so staggering you can barely comprehend it, where the rhetorical sleight of hand transforms into material violence against working people. Trump dubbed the legislation the One Big Beautiful Bill, and he promises no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, framing these as populist gifts to the working class. But here's what he doesn't tell you, and what the entire conservative propaganda apparatus is designed to obscure, which is that all 3 new breaks on taxes from tips, overtime and Social Security are set to expire in 2028, just before Trump leaves office. Meaning these aren't permanent structural changes to help workers, but rather temporary political bribes designed to last exactly long enough to get Republicans through the next election cycle before they evaporate into thin air. The policies apply to federal income taxes, meaning those who don't make enough income in general to pay such taxes wouldn't be impacted, which is to say that the poorest workers, the people who most desperately need relief, won't see a dime from these supposed giveaways because they already don't earn enough to pay income taxes in the first place, while payroll taxes, which pay for Social Security and Medicare, would still be collected, so workers still get hit with the regressive taxation that funds the social safety net, while the wealthy pocket genuine permanent cuts to their tax obligations. And speaking of the wealthy, let's excavate the real story buried beneath Trump's carnival barker salesmanship, because while he's distracting you with promises of tax-free tips, the actual distribution of benefits tells a story of class warfare being waged with surgical precision. Trump's proposals would lead to a tax cut for the richest 5% of Americans and a tax increase for all other income groups, with the richest 1% receiving an average tax cut of about $36,300 and all other groups seeing tax increases, with the middle 20% paying about $1,000, $500 more, and the lowest income 20% paying about $800 more, which means that while Trump stands there bragging about helping waitresses and overtime workers, he's actually orchestrating a massive upward transfer of wealth that would make the robber barons of the Gilded Age blush with envy. The highest income households would receive more than 45% of the benefits if the expiring provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are extended, and the top 1% by income will receive tax cuts totaling $1.02 trillion over the next decade. From this legislation, a figure so obscene that it defies comprehension, representing the wholesale looting of the public treasury to enrich people who already have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. But wait, because it gets so much worse and you need to understand the full horrific scope of what's being proposed here. The U.S. fiscal gap was entirely created by Republican tax cuts of 2001, 2003, and 2017, and extending the expiring provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would increase the fiscal gap by nearly 50%, from 2.1% to 3.3%, which means Republicans have spent 2 decades systematically dismantling the revenue base that funds everything from infrastructure to education to healthcare, creating artificial scarcity through tax giveaways to the wealthy, and now they're proposing to accelerate that destruction while financing the $4 trillion needed to extend Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act through either deficit spending or through massive spending cuts, including to key social safety net programs like Medicaid. This is the choice they're presenting to America with a smile and a wink: either blow up the deficit to unprecedented levels or gut the programs that millions of poor and working-class people depend on for survival. And either way, the rich get their tax cuts, while everyone else suffers the consequences through degraded public services or economic instability, or both simultaneously, in some kind of neoliberal hellscape feedback loop. And let's return to Trump's comment about being one heart attack from disaster, because the casual acknowledgement of Republican dysfunction reveals something profound about the contemporary conservative movement that we need to name explicitly. Several House Republicans grew frustrated with Johnson during the final days of the 11/18 Congress, which saw a bitter fight over spending that nearly caused a government shutdown before Christmas, and Johnson could afford only one defection, and a second would block him from getting the gavel bit, which means the Republican Party is so fractured, so consumed by internal ideological warfare between the merely plutocratic wing and the fully fascistic wing, that they can barely govern even when they control all the levers of power. In just about every corner of the Republican Party, Johnson is facing angry members, many of whom view the House Speaker as part of the problem, because conservatism in America has reached such an advanced stage of decay that it can no longer even pretend to offer coherent governance, instead devolving into factional infighting and performative cruelty, while the entire institutional apparatus teeters on the edge of collapse. Trump threw his support behind Speaker Mike Johnson, giving him his complete and total endorsement, which was an early win for Johnson, whose speakership hangs in the balance. But even Trump's endorsement couldn't prevent Representative Thomas Massie from opposing Johnson, with Massie writing that Trump's endorsement would work out about as well as his endorsement of Paul Ryan, and criticizing Johnson for partnering with Democrats to send money to Ukraine, authorize spying on Americans, and blow the budget, which tells you everything about the death spiral of Republican politics, where even the cult leaders' explicit commands can't keep the true believers in line, because they've been radicalized beyond the point where traditional political incentives and power dynamics function anymore. The party has created a monster it can no longer control, a base so inflamed by conspiracy theories and grievance politics that they'll turn on anyone who displays even the slightest hint of pragmatism or compromise. And now Trump stands there joking about heart attacks while his party consumes itself from within. But here's where we need to zoom out and see the full picture, because the dysfunction isn't accidental, it's structural. It flows inevitably from the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the conservative project. Republicans have spent decades telling working-class Americans that government is the enemy, that taxation is theft, that collective action through democratic institutions is tyranny, all while quietly serving the interests of a tiny oligarchic elite that has captured virtually all the gains from economic growth since the 1970s. Trump's 2017 tax reform law cut taxes on the wealthiest Americans and corporations, permanently reducing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, and lowering tax rates for the wealthiest people from nearly 40% to 37%. And now he wants to extend and expand those cuts while dressing them up in populist language about helping waitresses and seniors, as if anyone with a functioning brain can't see through the grotesque charade. The great big beautiful bill that Trump celebrates represents the apotheosis of this con, the moment when the mask slips completely and you can see the naked class warfare beneath the rhetoric. Republicans helped Trump pass his one big beautiful bill spending package, but most of those provisions won't be felt before Election Day, and the more painful cuts to pay for them don't kick in until after ballots are counted, which is to say they've designed this entire scheme to deliver short-term sugar highs followed by long-term pain, betting that voters are too stupid or too distracted to notice the bait and switch until it's too late to do anything about it. And maybe they're right. Maybe the combination of right-wing media saturation and algorithmic radicalization and good old-fashioned false consciousness has created an electorate that will cheer for its own immiseration as long as the right people are doing the immiserating and the right enemies are being hurt even worse. Let's talk about the historical parallels, because we've been here before. We've seen what happens when oligarchic elites capture the political system and use it to extract wealth from the many to enrich the few. the Gilded Age, the 1920s, the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, each period characterized by extreme inequality, political corruption, financial speculation, and a bipartisan consensus that the market must be allowed to work its magic without interference from meddling do-gooders who care about things like fairness or sustainability or human dignity. Together with the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts enacted under President Bush, Trump's law has severely eroded the country's revenue base and accelerated the draining of collective revenues to fund the things we need, which is exactly the playbook that conservatives have run repeatedly throughout American history, starving the government of revenue through tax cuts for the rich, then pointing to the resulting deficits as proof that government doesn't work, and using that manufactured crisis as justification for further cuts to programs that benefit working people. And here's Johnson, this milquetoast theocrat, played an instrumental role behind the scenes in Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election, now elevated to speaker because he's bland enough and obsequious enough to serve as Trump's legislative errand boy while maintaining a veneer of respectability that the more openly fascistic members of the caucus can't manage. After less than a year as Trump's speaker, not many view Johnson as up to the challenge, and even the most Trumpian lawmakers are starting to have their doubts, complaining that Johnson has stifled their voices, which would be funny if it weren't so terrifying, watching these people devour each other over who can be the most purely ideological while the country burns around them. Trump says they had the biggest tax cut in history, the biggest regulation cuts in history, as if destroying worker protections and environmental safeguards and consumer rights represents some kind of achievement worth celebrating, rather than a civilizational regression toward a Hobbesian nightmare of corporate dominance and exploitation. And then he rattles off the supposed benefits: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, repeating the mantra like an incantation that will make it true through sheer force of repetition. But the reality is that the end of Social Security taxes, as promised by Trump, is not included in the bill, but instead millions of seniors could benefit from a new bonus being considered by lawmaker, which is a much weaker and more limited provision than what Trump claims he's delivering. Yet another example of the gap between the rhetoric and the reality, between the populist branding and the plutocratic substance. What we're witnessing here is a masterclass in the politics of distraction and misdirection, where Trump and the entire Republican apparatus have learned that you can get away with almost anything, as long as you're loud enough and brazen enough, and willing to lie without shame or hesitation. Part of the reason for the discord lies with Johnson's support for the bipartisan budget bill that was ultimately signed into law, with several Republicans opposing the measure for failing to rein in spending, because even when Republicans control government, they can't actually govern, can't pass the bills they claim to want, can't deliver on the promises they make, because their entire worldview is premised on the idea that government is illegitimate, and so they're constitutionally incapable of wielding power responsibly, even when they have it. And Trump just says it, just admits that they were one heart attack from disaster, that their hold on power is so tenuous, and their coalition so fractured, that a single medical emergency could have brought down the whole house of cards, and he says it with this weird mixture of pride and terror, like he's simultaneously boasting about how clever they are for maintaining control under such precarious circumstances, and revealing his deep anxiety that it could all fall apart at any moment. This is what happens when a political movement becomes entirely untethered from anything resembling principle or consistency, when the only thing holding it together is tribal loyalty and the shared project of enriching the donor class, while keeping the base inflamed with culture war grievances, so they don't notice they're being robbed blind. The tax provisions in this bill are designed with diabolical precision to create the appearance of helping workers while actually delivering the vast majority of benefits to the wealthy. Trump has proposed preferencing several types of income, like tips, overtime pay, and Social Security benefits, and these new carve-outs would be most advantageous to upper-middle-class Americans because the highest-income families don't receive large amounts of these forms of income, and lower and moderate-income families are generally not positioned to make full use of these tax exemptions, which means the structure itself is regressive, designed to exclude the poorest workers while providing maximum benefit to people who are already comfortable, all wrapped up in rhetoric about standing with the working class against the elites. It's obscene, it's insulting, and it's exactly what we should expect from a party that has perfected the art of representing the interests of capital while claiming to speak for labor, and Johnson stands there nodding along, praising Trump's genius, celebrating the great big beautiful bill as some kind of legislative triumph, when in reality, it's a heist, a smash-and-grab robbery of the public treasury, executed in broad daylight with the perpetrators so confident in their impunity that they're literally making jokes about it on camera. House Republicans find themselves struggling to explain what they've accomplished with their party in full control, with only 46 bills signed into law by Trump, putting this Congress on track to be the do-nothingest Congress in a generation. Because when your entire political project is premised on the idea that government shouldn't do things, you can't actually govern when you win elections. You can only obstruct and destroy and transfer wealth upward while claiming you're fighting for the forgotten American. The clip should be played on repeat, should be seared into the consciousness of every voter who needs to understand what's actually happening here beneath the bluster and the branding. Trump's casual admission that Republican control hangs by a thread, his gleeful celebration of a bill that will primarily benefit the wealthy, while throwing temporary crumbs to workers that will disappear right before he leaves office. His description of Johnson as fantastic for ramming through legislation that will explode the deficit while gutting the social safety net. All of it adds up to a portrait of a political movement in its terminal phase, no longer even pretending to govern in the public interest, just grabbing everything it can before the whole rotten structure collapses. When the spending legislation was unveiled, it immediately sparked anger from multiple members of the House Republican Conference, with Johnson having pledged to avoid massive end-of-year spending bills that conservatives loathe, but Republicans' slim majority meant Johnson needed Democratic votes to pass the bill, giving the minority more leverage, which tells you everything about the impossible position Republicans have created for themselves, unable to satisfy their extremist base while also unable to actually govern without Democratic cooperation, trapped in a doom loop of their own making, where every compromise necessary to keep the government functioning becomes a betrayal in the eyes of the true believers who've been fed a steady diet of revolutionary rhetoric and apocalyptic thinking. And Trump loves it. You can hear it in his voice, the way he describes being one heart attack from disaster, with this strange mixture of anxiety and excitement, like a gambler describing how close he came to losing everything at the casino last night. Except this isn't a game. These are people's lives we're talking about. Real human beings who depend on Social Security and Medicaid and food assistance and all the other programs that Republicans are salivating to cut in order to pay for tax breaks for billionaires and corporations. No matter how the TCJA extensions are financed, the result will hurt most working families, especially low-income households, and the most damaging way would be with spending cuts for programs like SNAP or Medicaid. But Republicans don't care. They've never cared. Because caring about poor people or working people or anyone outside their donor class would require them to acknowledge that their entire worldview is a lie, that trickle-down economics is a scam, that the free market won't solve our problems, that we need robust democratic institutions and progressive taxation and social solidarity to create a decent society. The great big beautiful bill is great and beautiful only if you're already wealthy, only if you benefit from the systematic dismantling of the regulatory state and the defunding of public services and the redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top that has been the consistent project of conservative governance for the past 4 decades. For everyone else, it's a disaster, a slow-motion catastrophe dressed up in populist rhetoric and sold through a propaganda apparatus so sophisticated that millions of people will probably cheer for their own impoverishment because Trump told them he's fighting for them against the coastal elites and the deep state and whatever other peonies he's invented this week to distract from the fact that he's picking their pockets while they applaud. We need to understand this moment, need to see it clearly for what it represents, which is the logical endpoint of a political movement built on lies and resentment, and the naked pursuit of power for its own sake. Republicans held the House, but Democrats gained 1 seat, leaving the GOP with an even narrower majority, and the growth of the Republican Freedom Caucus combined with the narrow majority may lead to further confrontations within the party and legislative gridlock, because they've created a monster they can't control, radicalized their base beyond the point where normal political incentives function, and now they're stuck in a situation where they can barely govern even when they win, where every legislative battle becomes an existential crisis, where the Speaker of the House can be toppled by a handful of malcontents at any moment. And Trump just admits it, just says the quiet part loud, that they were one heart attack from disaster, that their entire agenda hangs by the thinnest of threads, that the only thing keeping them in power is luck and demographic advantage, and the systematic suppression of voting rights in states they control. He doesn't even pretend anymore, doesn't bother with the usual pieties about democracy or representation or the will of the people, just nakedly describes the mechanics of minority rule while celebrating a tax bill that will accelerate inequality and undermine the fiscal foundations of the federal government and make it harder for future generations to address the cascading crises we face from climate change to infrastructure decay, healthcare costs, to educational attainment. This is who they are, this is what they believe, and they're telling us directly without shame or hesitation, because they've learned that it doesn't matter, that their base will support them no matter what they do, as long as they maintain the right cultural signifiers and attack the right enemies and feed the endless hunger for validation and belonging that right-wing media has so expertly cultivated and exploited. The great big beautiful bill is beautiful only in its brazenness, in the sheer audacity of claiming to help workers while primarily benefiting the wealthy, in the sophisticated cruelty of designing tax breaks that expire right before Trump leaves office, so the political consequences fall on whoever comes next, in the casual admission that Republican governance is one medical emergency away from collapse. We have to fight this, have to expose it, have to build a political movement powerful enough to defeat it, and construct an alternative vision based on genuine solidarity and equality and democratic participation rather than oligarchic rule dressed up in populist drag. The stakes couldn't be higher, the choice couldn't be clearer, and Trump just handed us the ammunition we need by admitting on camera exactly what the Republican project actually is beneath all the rhetoric and spin. One heart attack from disaster, he says, and he means it, and we need to make sure that disaster arrives at the ballot box before it arrives in some hospital room where the fate of American democracy hangs on a single Republican heartbeat.